When we look at cognitive biases and heuristics, we find that there are roughly two kinds. Those that can create either intellectual humility or arrogance, depending on content. And these are ones that there's nothing intrinsic that causes people to always be inflated about their knowledge or deflated. It's simply an interaction with the particular content of what the bias is about. And yet there are other biases that continually create intellectual arrogance. That is to say, no matter what the content, they tend to make one think one's more intelligent or knows more than one really does. Those that consistently create intellectual humility may be quite rare, and we'll consider reasons for this asymmetry, why there are more biases that create intellectual arrogance and humility later. Now, one other point before we get deeper into the topic, the focus here is on general patterns, not individual differences. That is to say, it's quite obvious that some people in general are more intellectually arrogant than others, some people have more humility, and those individual difference variables are of course of interest, but that's not the focus of this lecture. Instead, the focus here is on general patterns that induce arrogance, humility in all of us. So let me talk first about heuristics that create either arrogance or humility. And this can emerge from any of the classic heuristics and biases that can cause either deflation or inflation depending on the content. If we think about it, there's lots of judgment and decision-making heuristics that could cause intellectual arrogance or humility. Base rate neglect, which we'll talk more about, the conjunction fallacy, which is difficulty in combining probabilities, the availability heuristic, which means that one relies too much on what comes to mind first, representative heuristic, which implies that we'd look at the most representative members of categories and assume they apply to all members of categories, and so on. There are all these classic heuristics and biases, and with the right valence and content, they can lead us to misestimate one's knowledge in either positive or negative direction. Then we illustrate with base rate neglect. The core effect is very simple. It allows local instances to overwhelm more general patterns of information. That is to say, one tends to ignore what might be a statistical pattern in a large population in favor of more local instances. Let me illustrate with respect to intellectual humility. Suppose I tell you that psychologists have discovered a test of severe spatial reasoning deficits. Now, this test has a 5% false positive rate. That is to say, 5% of the time identifies people with normal spatial reasoning skills as having a severe spatial reasoning deficit. But it's 100% accurate at identifying people with real deficits. And it turns out that only 1 out of 1,000 people have the severe spatial reasoning deficit. Now, given all that, suppose that you are tested as having the deficit, and I ask you, how likely is that you have a severe spatial reasoning deficit? If you ask most people about this, they would say, gee, I'd guess the odds are close to 95%. But the real number is about 2% because they failed to take into account that base rate of 1 out of 1,000. When we set up the problem this way, when it's a spatial reasoning deficit, we have a case of inducing intellectual humility. People are going to see this data, they're going to assume they're really quite inferior intellectually at spatial reasoning and come to the faulty conclusion because of this base rate neglect. So that's intellectual humility being induced by a heuristic, but you can also get intellectual arrogance by simply flipping what you're testing. Suppose instead we say psychologists have devised a test of extraordinary spatial reasoning ability. This test has a 5% false positive rate of identifying people with normal spatial reasoning abilities as having extraordinary spatial reasoning abilities. So now it's in the positive direction. But it's 100% accurate in identifying people with extraordinary abilities. Only 1 out of 1,000 people has extraordinary spatial reasoning abilities. Now let's say you take a test and your test is having this positive extraordinary ability. How likely is that you really have it? Some would answer that the odds are close to 95%, but again, the real odds are closer to 2% because people tend to neglect the 1 out of 1,000 figure. So here we have a case where the bias yields intellectual arrogance. The point here is that you can go either way depending on what it is that the bias is about. Now, many other heuristics could cause either intellectual humility or arrogance depending on the content valence. But the critical point here is none would represent a consistent pressure for or against intellectual humility. There might be minor pressure if the valence itself is biased. So perhaps tests of mental ability are more often framed in terms of extreme positive performance, such as various Mensa tests, in which case one might then be more prone to come up with intellectual arrogance rather than humility. But I want to focus most of this lecture on the classes of heuristics that consistently foster intellectual arrogance. So these are ones that, regardless of content, tend to focus or increase arrogance. And there are 3. general overconfidence effects, developmental overoptimism, and illusions of knowing, understanding, and insight, and illusions of explanation, all of which we'll call knowledge-driven effects. We'll focus much of our talk on the illusions of knowing and developmental overoptimism, but let me start with general overconfidence effects. These often arise, the general overconfidence effects, from self-enhancing social motivational pressures. For example, if one wants to think that one is intellectually gifted or particularly precocious or in some other way has intellectual strengths, one might engage in downward social comparison. What this means is one compares oneself to people who have less intellectual prowess than oneself, or at least what one thinks do, and that makes one feel better. So it's often a strategy that people use to try to enhance their own self-image by trying to think about comparison cases that are clearly not fair in the sense that they're people who have more limited abilities. A related effect is what we call downward difficulty assessments, and this is where one tests oneself on tasks which are simpler than perhaps that are legitimate comparison cases. For example, suppose one thought one was a great computer programmer, and one tested one's ability to computer program by assigning oneself really simple computer programming examples. In doing that, one could feel very good because one whips right through them, gets everything right, but it might not be a fair comparison because one's assessing oneself with tasks that are oversimplified. It's when shown that if the task is more difficult than normal, and one constructs the task so it looks that way, or the people actually select more difficult tasks, then you can get the opposite, worse than average effects. True intellectual humility, one thinks, oh my goodness, I'm not good at all at computer programming because I can't handle this problem. But by and large, people tend to engage in downward difficulty assessments because it makes them feel good about their competence. All of this can also be propelled by other biases, such as the hindsight bias, which is the feeling that after one's done a task that one knew it all along, when one reconstructs the past history to make oneself look more positive. It can have to do with attribution biases, where if one fails at a task, one blames it to situational factors like it's too noisy in the room where I was tested, or there were distractions, or I was tired. But when one does well in the task, one attributes that to one's native abilities and says that's because I'm really competent and smart. And finally, confirmation biases, where one looks for evidence that supports the case that one is smart, and one ignores evidence that supports the case that one is not doing as well or doesn't know as much. These often reflect self-enhancement motivation, which is a powerful driver. People want to feel that they're competent and have great ability and that they're doing well compared to their peers. All of these can intersect with some of our cognitive factors, as we'll see.